Jonathan Blackwell adjusted the sleeves of his tailored suit as he entered the grand auction hall, a space overflowing with wealth and whispers. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gleaming marble floors, while sharp-eyed collectors and dignitaries filled the room. His attention flickered between the art pieces displayed, mostly relics from forgotten artists, but all carrying a sense of importance only money could buy. This auction was meant to be routine. Jonathan had attended hundreds like it, adding to his vast collection of masterpieces that hung in his sprawling mansion. But today, something was different. His eyes were drawn to a painting on the far side of the room, a quiet landscape of a misty countryside, nothing like the bold, dramatic pieces that usually caught his eye. He couldn't explain why he felt compelled to bid on it. It was modest, almost too simple for his taste. But there was an odd pull. When the auctioneer's gavel hit the block, it was his name they called as the final bidder. He'd bought it for a fraction of his usual splurges. The painting was wrapped and handed over to him with little fanfare. It was only after he brought it home that night, as he hung it in his study, that the real mystery began to unfold. The frame was old, ornate, and slightly worn. As Jonathan tilted it to the side to adjust the lighting, he noticed something peculiar, a slight bulge at the back of the canvas. He frowned, running his fingers over it, feeling an unevenness where there shouldn't be one. With a sharp tug, the back of the frame creaked and then popped open, revealing a thin, yellowed envelope tucked inside. His breath caught. He wasn't expecting this. Carefully, he slid the envelope out. There was no name on the front, just a date, April 17, 1975, written in faded ink. His heart raced with an inexplicable thrill. He unfolded the brittle paper inside, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. "My dearest Victoria, I cannot stay in this lie much longer. Our love is a fire that consumes me, but the world demands I turn away. I wish I had the courage to defy them all and run away with you, but my hands are tied. This family, this name, it's a weight I cannot escape. I promise you this, my heart will always belong to you, no matter what is decided in the days to come. One day, we will be together, if not in this life, then in the next. Yours always, George." Jonathan's hands shook. His father's name was George Blackwell. The letter slipped from his grasp, landing softly on the desk. His mind reeled with confusion. His father had never mentioned anyone named Victoria. Jonathan had grown up believing his parents' marriage, while cold and businesslike, had been the foundation of the Blackwell family legacy. This letter, its tenderness, its secrecy, revealed something far more personal and more dangerous. His father had an affair, a hidden relationship. But who was Victoria, and why had this letter been hidden behind a painting? The date on the letter was only 2 months before his parents' wedding. The man he had idolized, the man who had built an empire, had kept a secret that could shake the foundations of everything Jonathan had known about his family. Staring at the old envelope, a realization crept over him. His family's wealth, their reputation, their legacy, it might have all been built on a lie. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He needed answers. Jonathan sat at his desk, the room dark except for the soft glow from the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The letter lay open in front of him, the words blurring as he read them over and over, trying to make sense of them. His father, George Blackwell, a man known for his strict adherence to family duty and public image, had kept a secret, one that Jonathan couldn't ignore. Who was Victoria? Why had this love letter been hidden, and what happened to her? These questions gnawed at him, and Jonathan knew he had to find answers. He couldn't confront his mother. Not yet. She had been distant for years, a frail woman more concerned with appearances than family bonds. And his sister, Claire? They hadn't spoken in months, not since their falling out over a business deal. But Claire had always hinted that their father wasn't the man he seemed to be. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he opened an online search. The name Victoria Blackwell brought up nothing relevant. Then he narrowed it down, searching for any mention of a woman named Victoria in his father's social circles from the 1970s. Still, nothing. Frustrated, Jonathan leaned back in his chair. He needed more than a random internet search to find out what had happened all those years ago. The next day, he took a more direct approach and hired a private investigator. He gave the man the letter, along with as much background information as he could about his father's life at the time. While waiting for the investigator to report back, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this secret ran deeper than a simple affair. In the meantime, he decided to reach out to Claire, even though their relationship had become strained. She answered the phone, her voice curt. "Jonathan, what do you want?" she asked. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said, keeping his tone even. "It's important. I found something about Dad." There was a pause on the other end, and then Claire sighed. "Dad? Really? He's been dead for years, Jonathan. Let it go. I found a letter. It's addressed to someone named Victoria. It's from before he and Mom got married." Claire's sharp breath told him she wasn't as indifferent as she pretended to be. "Victoria?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "And it's not just a letter. He was in love with her. He wanted to be with her, but something happened. I need to find out who she was." Another long silence. "I always knew Dad had secrets," Claire muttered. "But Victoria? I've never heard of her." Jonathan could hear her shifting. Her curiosity piqued despite her cold demeanor. "You always said Dad wasn't the man we thought he was," Jonathan pressed. "What did you mean?" Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. "I meant Dad was good at playing roles. The loving husband, the family man, the devoted father. But he was always focused on the Blackwell empire. You and I were nothing more than extensions of that legacy. And Mom," she hesitated. "Mom was his perfect partner in that sense. She knew how to play her role too." Jonathan frowned. "You think Mom knew about this?" "I think Mom knew a lot more than we realize," Claire said. "But if you're looking for answers, you won't get them from her. She'll deny everything." The conversation left Jonathan more unsettled than before. Claire was right about one thing. His mother wouldn't be forthcoming about his father's hidden life. But that didn't mean the truth couldn't be uncovered elsewhere. Days later, the private investigator called. "I've got something," the man said, "but I'm not sure what it means yet. There was a large transfer of money made by your father a month before his death. The money went to an account in the name of Victoria Adams." "Adams?" Jonathan was confused. "Not Blackwell?" "No, not Blackwell," the investigator confirmed. "But it's the only mention I've found of that name tied to your father." Jonathan's pulse quickened. So Victoria was real. His father had sent her money. Why? Had they reconnected before his death? Or had she threatened to reveal their past? The investigator continued, "I'm still digging. But it's clear your father didn't sever ties with this woman completely." Jonathan stared at the letter, the elegant handwriting that now seemed to mock him. His father had kept secrets, and it appeared that those secrets were tied to more than just a love affair. There was money involved, and possibly something much darker. As Jonathan pieced together the growing puzzle, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stop looking into this. It's not your business. Walk away while you still can." Jonathan's blood ran cold. The past wasn't just a hidden love story. It was a danger still lurking in the present. The text message lingered in Jonathan's mind, a chilling reminder that his investigation into his father's past was not just a private matter. It was a threat. Someone didn't want him digging further, but Jonathan was never one to back down from a challenge. Still, the cryptic message unsettled him. Who could be watching him, and how closely? He sat in his office, the letter from his father laid out before him, next to the investigator's report. The transfer of money to Victoria Adams had opened more questions than answers, and now this warning had raised the stakes. Jonathan knew there was only one person he could turn to for help now, his sister, Claire. Despite their strained relationship, Claire had always been perceptive about the family, particularly their father's secrets. Jonathan called her again, his nerves tight as he paced the room. "What now?" Claire answered, her tone impatient. "I need to see you," Jonathan said, not bothering with pleasantries. "It's serious." Claire hesitated. "What's going on?" "I got a text," Jonathan said, his voice low. "A warning. Someone doesn't want me looking into Dad's past." There was a pause, and then Claire sighed. "Fine. Come over. But make it quick." When Jonathan arrived at Claire's townhouse, she was already waiting for him, arms crossed as she stood in the doorway. Her sharp eyes studied him as he walked up the steps, her expression a mixture of frustration and concern. "You look like hell," Claire said, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks for the warm welcome," Jonathan muttered, brushing past her. He moved into the living room, feeling the tension settle over them. They had been distant for years, ever since a failed business deal that had driven a wedge between them, but now they both knew something bigger was at stake. Claire poured herself a glass of wine, watching him. "What's this about? You said you got a text?" Jonathan handed her his phone, showing her the message. Claire read it, her brow furrowing. "This is serious," she said, her voice softening. "Who could be behind this?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Jonathan replied. "I hired a private investigator, and he found a money transfer Dad made to someone named Victoria Adams before he died. I think this Victoria is the same woman from the letter." "Victoria Adams?" Claire repeated, frowning. "Why does that name sound familiar?" Jonathan watched her closely, his heart quickening. "You've heard it before?" Claire thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'm not sure where, but it rings a bell. It's probably just the name Victoria. I don't know." Jonathan rubbed his temples in frustration. "Whoever she is, she's tied to Dad, and someone's trying to cover it up. There's more to this than just an affair. There's money involved. Maybe something worse." Claire took a sip of her wine, her eyes narrowing. "Have you talked to Mom about any of this?" "No. You said it yourself. She'd deny everything," Jonathan said. "Besides, if she knew, she would have told us by now." Claire snorted. "You really believe that? Mom's been covering for Dad her entire life. She's always known more than she let on." Jonathan looked up at her, a sudden realization dawning. "Thomas." "Who?" Claire asked, confused. "Thomas Henderson," Jonathan said. "He was Dad's friend. He knew everything about the family. I bet he knows who Victoria Adams is." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Thomas? He hasn't been around in years. You think he'd talk to us?" Jonathan shrugged. "It's worth a shot. He was always close to Dad. He might know something." After a moment's hesitation, Claire nodded. "Fine. Let's go see him. If anyone knows what Dad was hiding, it's him." They arrived at Thomas Henderson's modest home in the early evening. The old man, now in his late 70s, had been a confidant of their father for decades, often handling sensitive business dealings and personal matters that never saw the light of day. As the door creaked open, Thomas stood before them, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of the Blackwell siblings standing on his doorstep. "Jonathan, Claire," he said, his voice gravelly, "this is unexpected." "We need to talk, Thomas," Jonathan said, wasting no time. "It's about our father." "And Victoria?" The mention of the name made Thomas visibly tense. His hand gripped the edge of the doorframe, and his eyes darkened. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but leave it alone," Thomas warned, his tone low. "We can't," Claire said, stepping forward. "There are too many secrets, and we need answers." Thomas glanced between them, and after a long pause, he sighed, motioning them inside. The living room was small and cluttered, a far cry from the lavish surroundings Jonathan was used to. They sat in stiff silence until Thomas finally spoke. "Victoria was your father's first love," Thomas began, his voice weary. "They were inseparable when they were young, but the Blackwell family didn't approve. They forced him to end it and marry your mother to preserve the family image." "We know that much," Jonathan said. "But what happened after that? Why was there still contact?" Thomas hesitated. "Your father couldn't let her go. Even after he married your mother, he stayed in touch with Victoria. They had a complicated relationship." Claire leaned in. "What about the money? He sent her a large amount just before he died." Thomas's face darkened. "That money wasn't just for her. Victoria found out something about your family. Something dangerous. Your father paid her off to keep her quiet." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "What did she know?" Thomas shook his head. "You don't want to go down that road. There are people, powerful people, who don't want the truth to come out." Claire glanced at Jonathan, her eyes wide with realization. This is bigger than an affair. Before Thomas could respond, there was a loud crash outside. The three of them froze, exchanging wary glances. Jonathan's stomach dropped as they rushed to the window. A sleek, Black car sped off down the street, disappearing into the night. Thomas paled. You've stirred up something dangerous. If you keep digging, they'll come for you too. The tension inside Thomas Henderson's living room was thick, and the silence that followed the car's rapid departure left Jonathan on edge. Claire's face was pale, her mind clearly racing through the possibilities. Jonathan's heart pounded, a dark realization settling in. This wasn't just a family secret. It was dangerous, and someone was watching their every move. Thomas leaned forward, his hands shaking slightly. You don't know what you're dealing with, he said, his voice low and urgent. The Blackwell family is more than just a legacy of wealth. There are people tied to your father's business who don't care about morality, only power. I tried to warn your father, but once he was in too deep, there was no getting out. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Claire. They were both caught in something far bigger than they'd imagined. What exactly did Victoria know? Jonathan pressed, his voice sharp with impatience. What could be so dangerous that it still matters decades later? Thomas hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting more trouble. Your father's business dealings weren't always clean, he finally admitted. In the early years, he made decisions that crossed moral and legal lines. Bribery, extortion, whatever it took to build the empire. Jonathan's stomach turned. He had always suspected that the Blackwell fortune wasn't as pristine as it appeared, but hearing it confirmed made the truth hit harder. And Victoria found out? Thomas nodded. She came across some documents, evidence that could have destroyed the entire Blackwell name. That's why George sent her money. It wasn't hush money. It was protection. She was a threat to everything your father had built. Claire's voice was shaky as she interjected. But if she had that kind of information, why didn't she expose it? Why didn't she come forward? Thomas leaned back, rubbing his temples as though the memories pained him. Victoria was in love with your father. She didn't want to ruin him. She wanted him to choose her, to leave the business and live a simpler life. But George, he was a man who couldn't walk away from power, even for love. So instead, he paid her off, thinking it would keep her quiet. Jonathan felt a mix of anger and pity rise in his chest. His father had been caught in a web of his own making, and now, decades later, it seemed that same web had ensnared Jonathan and Claire. What happened to Victoria after that? Jonathan asked, fearing the worst. She disappeared, Thomas said quietly. Some say she fled the country. Others think she changed her name and lived in hiding. But the truth is, no one knows. The money stopped flowing after your father's death, and no one has seen or heard from her since. Claire shook her head, clearly unsettled. But why the threats now? If Victoria's gone, what are they trying to hide? Thomas hesitated again, his gaze flickering nervously to the door. You're asking the wrong questions. It's not about what Victoria knew anymore. It's about what might come to light if you keep pushing. There are still people who have a stake in the Blackwell name, people who will do anything to keep the past buried. A shiver ran down Jonathan's spine. Who's behind this? He demanded, his frustration boiling over. Who's watching us? Thomas met his gaze, his expression grim. There are more players in this than you realize. Some of your father's old business partners are still around, still powerful, and they have deep connections. You're stepping on dangerous ground, Jonathan. They're not just going to sit back and let you expose their secrets. Before Jonathan could respond, Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening as she read the message. What is it? Jonathan asked, his nerves already frayed. Claire looked up, her voice barely a whisper. It's from Mom. Jonathan stiffened. What does she want? Claire swallowed, her face tense. She says we need to come to the house immediately. She has something to tell us. Something about Dad. They drove in silence to their mother's mansion, the tension between them heavy with unspoken fears. Jonathan's mind raced as they neared the estate. Their mother, Margaret Blackwell, had always been cold and distant, a woman more concerned with appearances than affection. She had lived her life as a perfect socialite, keeping her husband's image untarnished, no matter the cost. But now, it seemed, she was ready to break her silence. They entered the grand foyer of the mansion, where their mother was waiting, her frail figure framed against the towering staircase. The house was eerily quiet, the usual hum of staff absent as Margaret turned to face her children. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I didn't think it would come to this, but it seems you've uncovered something I've tried to protect for years." Jonathan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Protect? You knew about Victoria, didn't you?" Margaret's eyes flashed with pain before she quickly masked it. "Of course I knew. How could I not? Your father's heart never truly belonged to me. He was always hers." Claire crossed her arms, her voice cold. "So, you just accepted that? You let him lie to us?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "It was more complicated than that. I had a family to protect. You two, the Blackwell name, everything we had built. Victoria was a threat to all of it." Jonathan's patience snapped. "What about the money? The dirty deals? We know Victoria had information that could have destroyed Dad." Margaret closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "Yes, she did. And I helped keep her quiet. I convinced your father to send her the money to ensure she wouldn't come back into our lives. But it wasn't enough, was it?" Jonathan took a step closer. "What happened to her? Is she still alive?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I don't know. After your father died, I lost track of her. But I've been warned, just like you. There are people who don't want the truth to come out, and they will do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Claire's voice trembled with anger. "You let them destroy our family. You let Dad ruin everything for a secret." Margaret looked away, her voice breaking. "I did what I thought was best." Just as Jonathan was about to demand more answers, there was a loud bang at the front door. All three of them turned as the door swung open, revealing two men in dark suits standing in the entryway. Their expressions were cold and menacing. "Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Blackwell," one of the men said calmly, "it's time to stop digging." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Jonathan's pulse raced as the two men in dark suits stepped inside, their cold expressions unwavering. Claire instinctively moved closer to Jonathan, while their mother, Margaret, stood frozen by the staircase, her hands trembling slightly. These men weren't just messengers. They were enforcers, here to make sure the Blackwell family stayed silent. "Who are you?" Jonathan demanded, his voice sharp but steady. "What do you want?" One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, glanced around the room before meeting Jonathan's gaze. "It's not about what we want, Mr. Blackwell. It's about what you need to stop. You've been digging where you don't belong." Claire's voice broke through the tense silence. "Is this some kind of threat? You can't just show up here." "We can," the man interrupted, his tone calm but lethal. "And we will, if necessary. This is your last warning. Let the past rest." Jonathan's anger flared. "What are you so afraid of? That will expose the truth about my father? About Victoria?" The other man, shorter but just as imposing, stepped forward. "It's not just about your father, Mr. Blackwell. This goes deeper than you know. There are people, powerful people, who have a stake in the Blackwell legacy, and they won't let you ruin what's been built." Jonathan squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "I don't care about the legacy. I care about the truth." The taller man's expression darkened. "The truth will bury more than your father's name. Walk away, or we'll make sure you regret it." Margaret finally spoke, her voice brittle but firm. "Please, leave my children out of this. I'll do whatever you want." Both men exchanged a glance before the shorter one nodded. "Good choice, Mrs. Blackwell. We suggest you keep it that way." Without another word, the men turned and walked out, the heavy thud of the door slamming behind them reverberating through the silent room. Jonathan stood still, his chest heaving with a mixture of fear and fury. Claire stared at the door, her face pale, while Margaret sank into a nearby chair, her strength seemingly drained. "What the hell was that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. "They're trying to scare us off. Whoever's behind this doesn't want us digging into Dad's past." Margaret, her face ashen, finally spoke again. "You don't understand. This isn't just about your father. The Blackwell family's connections run deep, deeper than you could ever imagine." Jonathan turned toward her, his patience wearing thin. "Then tell us. Stop hiding, Mom, what aren't you saying? Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. Your father wasn't just involved in shady business deals. There were powerful figures, politicians, corporations, who relied on him. He made alliances that were far-reaching, and some of those alliances were built on illegal foundations. He wasn't clean, Jonathan, but he wasn't the only one. Claire's voice hardened. So you're saying Dad was part of some criminal network? Margaret's lips trembled. It was more than that. He was involved in international dealings that couldn't be traced. Money laundering, off-the-books operations. It was all hidden behind the family's legitimate business. And Victoria, she found out. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Victoria knew about all of it? Margaret nodded slowly. She discovered some of the documents, evidence that could have brought the entire network down. That's why your father had to send her away. He couldn't protect her and keep the empire intact. He chose the family over her. Claire let out a bitter laugh. And now that we're digging into it, we've put ourselves in the crosshairs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you involved in any of this. Jonathan stared at his mother, anger boiling under the surface. Protect us? By keeping us in the dark? You let Dad's secrets eat away at everything, and now we're the ones paying the price. Margaret's head dropped into her hands, her body trembling. I never imagined it would come to this. Jonathan clenched his fists, his mind spinning. We need to figure out who these people are. Who's running this network now? Margaret looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. No, Jonathan. You need to stop. They've already warned you. If you keep pushing, they'll come after you. After all of us. Jonathan shook his head, his determination hardening. I won't let them control us. Not anymore. Claire took a step forward, her voice quiet but resolute. Jonathan's right. We've come too far to turn back now. Just then, Margaret's phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, her face turning even paler. Her hands shook as she picked it up and answered. Hello? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent as Margaret listened, her expression growing more and more strained with each passing second. Finally, she hung up, her hand trembling as she placed the phone back on the table. What is it? Jonathan asked, his voice tight. Margaret's eyes filled with dread. That was the hospital. Daniel's been in an accident. Jonathan's heart stopped. Daniel? What happened? Margaret's voice shook as she answered. He was hit by a car. It wasn't an accident, Jonathan. They're sending a message. Jonathan's world spun the moment he heard Margaret's words. It wasn't an accident. His half-brother, Daniel, was in the hospital, targeted because of Jonathan's search for the truth. It wasn't just their father's secrets that had pulled them in. Now someone was actively working to stop them from discovering the full story, no matter the cost. We need to go, Jonathan said, his voice urgent. Claire was already grabbing her bag, and Margaret, pale and shaken, struggled to stand. The weight of everything seemed to press down on her all at once. But there was no time for hesitation. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel as he replayed the events in his mind. The letter, the cryptic warning, the men who had threatened them, and now this. Daniel, his half-brother, was part of this mystery, but he had never asked to be involved. Jonathan's reckless pursuit of the truth had dragged him into the crossfire. Claire sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face tight with worry. Do you think he'll be okay? She asked quietly, her voice trembling. He has to be, Jonathan muttered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. When they arrived at the hospital, the sterile lights and antiseptic smell hit Jonathan like a wave. His heart pounded as he rushed to the front desk. Daniel Adams, he said breathlessly. He was brought in after an accident. The receptionist looked up, her expression neutral. Room 314, third floor. He's still in surgery. Jonathan felt his stomach twist. Surgery. That meant it was serious. Claire squeezed his arm gently, trying to steady him, but her face was just as pale. They took the elevator to the third floor in silence, both bracing for whatever awaited them. As they stepped into the waiting area outside the operating room, they spotted Daniel's small, makeshift family. His friends and a few concerned neighbors were sitting quietly, their faces somber. Jonathan's heart sank further. He hadn't been there for Daniel, had never even met him until recently, and now, the boy he barely knew was fighting for his life. Margaret sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her hands wringing in her lap. She looked older, more fragile than Jonathan had ever seen her. Her perfect image of the Blackwell matriarch was shattered, and all that remained was a mother terrified of losing another son. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged from the operating room. Jonathan leapt to his feet, his breath caught in his throat. "How is he?" The doctor removed his mask, his expression grim. "He's stable, but it was a close call. He suffered multiple fractures and internal bleeding. We were able to stop the bleeding, but it's going to be a long recovery." Jonathan felt the weight lift slightly from his chest. Daniel was alive, but the relief was short-lived. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. Daniel had been targeted. This was no accident. "Can we see him?" Claire asked, her voice soft but insistent. The doctor nodded. "He's still unconscious, but you can go in briefly." Jonathan and Claire exchanged a glance before they followed the nurse into Daniel's room. The sight of him, pale and bandaged, lying motionless in the hospital bed, sent a chill through Jonathan. This was all his fault. He had pushed too hard, and now Daniel was paying the price. Claire stood beside the bed, her hand resting on Daniel's arm. "We need to stop this," she whispered. "We can't keep digging. Look what's happening." But Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that stopping now would leave too many questions unanswered. "We're too close," he said. "Whoever's behind this knows we're getting close to something big. That's why they're coming after us." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of fear and anger. "And what if someone else gets hurt? What if they come after us next?" Jonathan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew Claire was right. This was no longer just about uncovering his father's past. It was about survival. But he also knew that walking away now would mean living in the shadow of fear, never knowing the full truth. As they stood in the quiet of Daniel's hospital room, Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another threat. Instead, it was a message from the private investigator. "Found something. Meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m. Café Lux. Come alone." Jonathan's pulse quickened. The investigator had uncovered more. But was this another trap? He couldn't be sure. Still, he knew he had to go. If there was any chance to end this, to protect Daniel and his family, he had to take it. Claire watched him closely, sensing his resolve. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, I'm going to see this through." The next morning, Jonathan sat in a corner booth at Café Lux, a small, dimly lit cafe tucked away from the bustling city streets. His nerves were frayed, and his mind raced with possibilities. The investigator's message had been brief and cryptic, but Jonathan hoped it would finally bring him the answers he needed. The investigator, a grizzled man named Sam, entered the cafe, his face set in a grim expression as he slid into the booth across from Jonathan. "You look like hell," Sam muttered, signaling the waitress for coffee. "I feel worse," Jonathan replied. "What did you find?" Sam leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I dug deeper into the financial transactions. Turns out, the money your father sent to Victoria wasn't just hush money. It was part of a much bigger operation." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Your father was involved in offshore accounts, illegal ones. He was laundering money through multiple shell companies, all tied to a network of high-level business people and politicians. Victoria found out, and she wasn't the only one." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "How deep does this go?" Sam sighed. "Deep enough that if the truth comes out, it could bring down a lot of people. That's why they're trying to shut you up. They don't care about your father's affair. They care about the money, the power, and the people who stand to lose everything if you expose them." Jonathan's mind raced. The entire Blackwell empire, the legacy he had grown up idolizing, had been built on corruption. And now, that same corruption was threatening to destroy him and everyone he cared about. "So what do I do?" Jonathan asked, his voice tight with frustration. Sam leaned back in his seat, his expression serious. "You have two options. Walk away and keep your family safe. or go public with what you found and bring down the whole house of cards. But make no mistake, if you go public, they'll come after you. And they won't stop until you're silenced. Jonathan sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Daniel, lying in the hospital, and the threat hanging over his family. But he also thought of the lies, the betrayals, and the legacy of greed and corruption that had poisoned everything. Could he really walk away? The weight of Sam's words lingered in Jonathan's mind long after the investigator left. His hands gripped the edge of the cafe table as his thoughts churned. The options laid before him were clear. Expose the dark underbelly of the Blackwell Empire or protect what little remained of his fractured family. But neither choice came without devastating consequences. As he sat in the quiet cafe, Jonathan felt the crushing pressure of the decision. Walking away meant ensuring safety, his, Claire's, and Daniel's. But what kind of life would they live, knowing the truth was buried and that their family's fortune had been built on corruption, lies, and illegal dealings? Every step of his investigation had revealed more layers of deceit, and now it seemed impossible to ignore. With a sigh, Jonathan stood and left the cafe, the early morning air sharp against his skin. He drove straight to the hospital, needing to see Daniel. He had nearly lost him, but the accident had been a warning. Whoever was pulling the strings in this tangled web wasn't going to let Jonathan and his family walk away without a fight. At the hospital, the hallway leading to Daniel's room was eerily quiet. Jonathan found Claire sitting by Daniel's bed, her face etched with exhaustion. She looked up when Jonathan entered, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and frustration. "Did you find out anything?" she asked softly, trying not to wake Daniel. Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. "I met with Sam. He found out more than I expected." He paused, unsure of how much to tell her. "It's not just about Dad's affair. The entire Blackwell fortune, the legacy, everything. It's tied to illegal activities. Offshore accounts, money laundering, corrupt business deals. It's much bigger than we thought." Claire's face paled as she absorbed the information. Illegal activities? So Dad was part of a criminal network, Jonathan finished, his voice heavy with disgust. And Victoria wasn't just someone he loved. She knew about it. That's why Dad sent her money. It wasn't to keep their affair quiet. It was to keep her from exposing the whole operation. Claire shook her head, disbelief mixing with anger. "And now they're targeting us? Because of something Dad did?" Jonathan nodded grimly. "It's not just about him anymore. If the truth comes out, it could ruin powerful people. People who will do anything to protect themselves." As they spoke, Daniel stirred in the bed, groaning softly as he woke. Jonathan and Claire immediately fell silent, watching as Daniel's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the sterile hospital lights. "Daniel," Jonathan said gently, moving closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" Daniel's face was pale, his expression groggy and confused. "What happened?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. Jonathan glanced at Claire, unsure how much to tell him. "You were in an accident," he said softly, "but you're going to be okay. The doctors say you'll recover." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion, and then the memories seemed to flood back all at once. His eyes widened with fear. "It wasn't an accident," he whispered. "They hit me on purpose." Jonathan's stomach tightened, confirming what he already knew. "Who?" he asked. "Who hit you?" Daniel winced, shifting uncomfortably in the bed. "I don't know who they were, but they followed me for a while. I noticed them in the car, but I thought I was just being paranoid. Then, they rammed into me. I didn't see their faces." Jonathan and Claire exchanged a tense look. Whoever these people were, they weren't just trying to scare them. They were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Daniel looked between them, sensing the gravity of the situation. Why are they doing this? What's going on? Jonathan hesitated. "Daniel, there's something you need to know. It's about our father." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for Jonathan to explain. "Our father wasn't who we thought he was," Jonathan continued. "He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was involved in illegal activities, things that could ruin the Blackwell name if they ever came to light. Victoria, your mother, she found out, and that's why she was sent away. Daniel's face contorted with a mix of shock and betrayal. "My mother knew?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knew enough to be a threat," Jonathan said gently. "And now, we're getting too close to exposing the truth. That's why they came after you." Daniel let out a long, shaky breath, his eyes searching Jonathan's face for answers. "So what now?" he asked. "Are we just supposed to give up and let them get away with it?" Claire spoke up, her voice firm but trembling. "If we keep pushing, they'll come after us again. We might not survive the next time." Jonathan nodded, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. "I have to make a choice," he said quietly. "We either walk away now and live with the lies, or we expose the truth and risk everything." The room fell into a heavy silence as the reality of the situation sank in. Claire looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. Daniel stared at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, processing the revelation that his life had been shaped by secrets and deceit. "I don't want to live in fear," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to die for something I didn't even know about." Jonathan's heart clenched. He had brought Daniel into this mess, and now his half-brother was paying the price for the sins of their father. He had wanted to protect him, to protect Claire, but every step they took seemed to pull them deeper into danger. As the tension in the room thickened, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "You're out of time. Make your decision, or we'll make it for you." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The threats were escalating, and the noose was tightening around them. "Who is it?" Claire asked, her voice filled with fear. Jonathan looked up, his face set with grim determination. "They're giving me a choice, but I think we all know what I have to do." Claire shook her head, her voice pleading. "Jonathan, if you keep going, they'll kill us." "I can't walk away from this," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "Dad built an empire on lies and blood, and now it's up to us to decide whether we let that continue." Daniel sat up slightly, wincing in pain but meeting Jonathan's gaze. "If you're going to do this, then do it. But you have to be smart. Don't let them catch you off guard." Jonathan nodded, his decision made. "We bring them down, but we do it on our terms." That evening, Jonathan sat alone in his study, staring at the family portrait on the wall. His father's stern face looked back at him, a man who had been larger than life, untouchable in his success. But now, that image was shattered. The truth had cracked the facade, and Jonathan knew that once the full story came out, the Blackwell name would never be the same. But maybe that was the price they had to pay. Maybe it was time to burn the legacy to the ground and build something new from the ashes. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sam. "We have what we need to take them down, but it's going to get messy." Jonathan stared at the message, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He typed a single reply. "Let's do it." The night was thick with anticipation as Jonathan sat in his darkened study, the only light coming from the glow of his phone. The decision had been made. He was going to expose the truth behind the Blackwell empire, no matter the cost. But before taking any drastic steps, Jonathan needed to be sure. The investigator, Sam, had told him they had what they needed, but the stakes were higher than ever. And there was still one last piece of the puzzle, Victoria's safety deposit box. It had come up before, mentioned by Daniel in their earlier conversations. Victoria had left behind a key, one that opened a box she had kept hidden for years. Inside, Jonathan suspected, was the final evidence that could either confirm or deny everything they had uncovered so far. The problem was, they weren't the only ones who knew about it. If Victoria had used that box to store information dangerous enough to threaten powerful people, then it was likely being watched. Jonathan couldn't go alone, not this time. He needed help, and there was only one person he trusted enough for this. The following morning, Jonathan pulled up in front of Claire's townhouse. She opened the door before he even had a chance to knock, her expression tired but resolute. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "We need to open the safety deposit box," Jonathan said without preamble. "It could have the final piece of evidence. Whatever Victoria left behind, it's still there." Claire's eyes widened. "You think that's the key to all of this?" "I don't know for sure," Jonathan admitted, pacing her living room, but it's something we can't afford to ignore. Dad paid Victoria off for a reason. Whatever she had over him was big enough to keep him scared, and I think the answers are in that box. Claire hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window, where the morning sun filtered through the blinds. Do you really think it's safe? After everything that's happened, Daniel, those men who showed up at the house? Jonathan stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes full of determination. It's not safe, but we don't have a choice. We've come too far, and if we stop now, we'll be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives. We need to finish this. Claire looked at him for a long moment before nodding. All right, she said softly. I'm with you. Let's get this done. The bank that held the safety deposit box was a small, unassuming building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't the kind of place that drew attention, which explained why Victoria had chosen it. But Jonathan knew better than to assume it would be easy. As they entered the bank, the sterile atmosphere did nothing to calm their nerves. Claire glanced around nervously, watching every movement of the few customers inside. Jonathan approached the front desk, where an elderly teller sat behind the counter. Good morning. I need access to a safety deposit box, Jonathan said, sliding the key Victoria had left behind across the counter. The teller squinted at the key, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll take you to the vault. Do you have your identification? Jonathan handed over his ID, his heart pounding as the teller checked it against her records. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded again and motioned for them to follow her. They were led through a narrow hallway to the back of the bank, where a large steel door waited. The teller unlocked it, revealing rows of metal boxes stacked along the walls. She pointed to one near the middle. Box 431, she said. Take your time. I'll be just outside if you need anything. As soon as the teller left, Jonathan and Claire exchanged a tense glance. They were finally here, standing before the box that had been hidden away for decades. Jonathan inserted the key into the lock, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned it. With a soft click, the door to the box swung open. Inside was a small stack of documents, neatly folded and yellowed with age. Jonathan carefully pulled them out, his heart racing as he began to unfold the first sheet. Claire stood close by, her breath held in anticipation. The first document was a letter, written in Victoria's familiar handwriting. Jonathan's eyes scanned the page, the weight of her words pressing down on him as he read. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this letter, then the truth is finally coming to light. I never wanted things to end this way, but I had no choice. George Blackwell built his empire on lies and deceit, and I uncovered more than I ever wanted to know. The documents in this box contain proof of the illegal dealings, the bribes, and the offshore accounts used to hide the truth. I kept this secret because I loved him once, but now I realize that the only way to protect my son and myself is to expose everything. I hope you have the courage to do what I could not. Victoria. Jonathan's hands shook as he lowered the letter. The confirmation he had been seeking was here. Victoria had known everything, and she had kept the evidence hidden all these years. But it wasn't just her letter that chilled him. Beneath it, there were copies of financial records, transactions linking George Blackwell to several shadowy business figures, politicians, and offshore accounts. This is it, Jonathan whispered, his voice filled with awe and dread. This is the proof. Claire leaned in, her eyes scanning the documents. These names, these accounts, it's all here. Everything they tried to hide. Jonathan swallowed hard, his mind racing. With these documents, they could bring down the entire Blackwell empire. But they were also holding the most dangerous pieces of information in the world, evidence that could get them killed. We have to be careful, Claire said, her voice trembling. We can't just go public with this. They'll come after us. Jonathan nodded. We need to get these to Sam. He can help us figure out how to release this without getting ourselves killed. As they quickly packed the documents back into the box, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every move. He shot a glance toward the door, half expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Let's get out of here, Jonathan muttered, his nerves fraying with each passing second. They left the bank without incident, but the tension only grew as they got back into the car. Claire kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking for any sign they were being followed. Jonathan drove in silence, his thoughts consumed by what they had just uncovered. They had the proof. They could finally expose the truth about their father, about the entire Blackwell legacy. But the men who had threatened them, the ones tied to the illegal network, wouldn't let them do it without a fight. That evening, Jonathan sat in his study, staring at the stack of documents spread out before him. The weight of the decision he had to make pressed down on him like a heavy fog. Claire had gone home, exhausted and terrified, while Daniel remained in the hospital, still recovering. Sam had called earlier, telling him he had contacts who could help leak the information anonymously. But even that felt like a risk. There was no telling how far the reach of these powerful people extended. As Jonathan sat there, his phone buzzed with a message from Sam. "We're ready. Tomorrow, we make our move. You need to be prepared for what comes next." Jonathan's breath caught. The endgame was coming, and he wasn't sure if any of them would survive it. Jonathan barely slept that night, his mind racing with the weight of what lay ahead. The documents in his possession could shatter the Blackwell legacy and bring down powerful people who had operated in the shadows for decades. But exposing the truth meant more than just ruining his father's empire. It meant painting a target on his back and on Claire, Daniel, and anyone close to them. Every decision felt like walking on the edge of a knife. Morning broke with a somber stillness. Jonathan stared at the documents spread across his desk, his mind replaying Victoria's words in the letter. "I hope you have the courage to do what I could not." He didn't feel courageous, but he knew that he couldn't back down now. Too much had happened. Daniel's near death, the threats, the lies. It was time to end this, no matter the cost. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sam, the investigator who had become his unexpected ally. "We're ready to move," Sam said without preamble. "I've got contacts in the media. If you want to go public, we can release the documents anonymously, but it's going to blow up fast. The moment this hits the press, those men will come after you hard." Jonathan swallowed the knot in his throat. "What are our other options?" Sam hesitated. "The only other choice is to stay quiet, keep the documents, and live with the fact that your father's legacy remains intact. But let's be real, Jonathan. If you don't expose them, they won't just walk away. They'll come after you anyway. You've gotten too close." Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew Sam was right. No matter what choice he made, the people behind this would never let him live in peace. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Claire. "We need to talk. I'm coming over." 30 minutes later, Claire arrived at Jonathan's house, her face pale and drawn. She was holding a newspaper, and the moment she stepped inside, she threw it on the table in front of him. "They're already trying to discredit us," Claire said, her voice shaking with anger. Jonathan glanced down at the paper. The headline read, "Blackwell Family Under Investigation. Allegations of Corruption and Scandal Rise." His heart sank as he skimmed the article, which painted their family in a negative light. But with a twist, they were being portrayed as the ones trying to cover up their father's sins. It was a preemptive strike from whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes, trying to shift the narrative before Jonathan and Claire could expose the truth themselves. "They're framing us as the corrupt ones," Claire said, her eyes blazing with frustration. "They're turning the whole story around. If we don't act now, this will be all anyone remembers about us." Jonathan clenched his fists, fury bubbling under the surface. "They're trying to control the narrative, make us look like we're the ones with something to hide." Claire sat down across from him, her voice suddenly quiet. "Jonathan, I'm scared. They almost killed Daniel, and now they're twisting everything. What if we can't win this?" Jonathan stared at her, his own fears mirroring hers. They were up against a machine, powerful people who controlled the media, the law, everything. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. If they stayed silent now, they would spend the rest of their lives haunted by this, hunted by it. "We have to act," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "We have the proof. The world needs to know the truth, no matter what." Claire's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. "All right, let's do it. But we need to be smart." Jonathan glanced at the stack of documents again, his resolve hardening. Sam's ready. He's got people in the media who can get the story out. Once it's out there, it'll spread too fast for them to contain. But what about the fallout? Claire asked, her voice trembling. What about Daniel? Mom? You know they'll come after them too. Jonathan's heart clenched. He hadn't spoken to his mother since the men showed up at her house. Margaret Blackwell had spent her life maintaining the family's reputation, protecting the empire at all costs. But even she had been powerless against the forces moving behind the scenes. I'll talk to Mom, Jonathan said after a moment. She needs to know what's coming. We'll protect Daniel too. We'll get him somewhere safe. Claire nodded, though her worry was evident. Just be careful, Jonathan. They're not going to let us do this without a fight. Later that afternoon, Jonathan drove to his mother's estate. The familiar sight of the grand mansion now felt oppressive, a monument to the lies and corruption that had built it. Margaret Blackwell had spent her life playing the role of the perfect socialite, but Jonathan had come to realize how much she had sacrificed to keep up the facade. Now, that facade was about to crumble. Margaret was waiting for him in the parlor, sitting stiffly in one of the ornate armchairs. She looked older than he remembered, her face drawn and pale. "Jonathan," she said, her voice brittle, "I wasn't expecting you." Jonathan wasted no time. "I'm here to tell you that it's over. We're exposing everything. The documents, the offshore accounts, Dad's illegal dealings. It's all going public." Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed to lose her composure. "You can't," she whispered. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Jonathan replied, his voice hard. "Dad built this empire on lies, and we've all been living under its shadow. We can't keep pretending everything's fine. People have died because of this." Margaret's hands trembled as she placed them in her lap. "Do you think I don't know that?" she snapped, her voice shaking. "Do you think I don't understand what's at stake? This isn't just about your father. It's about all of us. The moment you expose this, they'll come after you. After Claire. After Daniel. Is that what you want?" Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. "I'm not letting them control us anymore. We're done living in fear." Margaret stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't know what they're capable of. Your father wasn't the only one involved. There are people, powerful people, who will stop at nothing to protect themselves. If you go through with this, they'll destroy you." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice softening. "Mom, I know you've been trying to protect us, but we're already in danger. The only way out is to bring this into the light." Margaret closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I've spent my whole life trying to hold this family together. But maybe it's time to let it go." Jonathan's throat tightened. He had never seen his mother so vulnerable, so broken. But he also knew she was right. The Blackwell name, the empire, everything they had been raised to protect, was about to be torn apart. "I'll keep you safe," Jonathan promised. "I'll keep Daniel safe too." Margaret nodded, though her eyes remained distant. "Do what you have to do, Jonathan. But be careful. Once this is out, there's no going back." That evening, Jonathan returned home and met with Sam. The plan was simple but risky. Release the documents to several media outlets at once, ensuring that the story spread too quickly for anyone to suppress it. Once the documents were in the public domain, the truth about the Blackwell Empire would be undeniable. As the hours ticked by, Jonathan, Claire, and Sam worked feverishly to prepare the files for release. Every second felt like a countdown to the moment their lives would change forever. Finally, at midnight, the files were sent. The silence that followed felt deafening. The truth was out there now, and all they could do was wait for the storm to hit. The truth was out. Jonathan stared at the glowing screen of his phone, watching as news outlets, websites, and social media exploded with the story of the Blackwell family's corruption. Headline after headline detailed the offshore accounts, the illegal transactions, and the shady business deals that had built the Blackwell empire. His father's name, once a symbol of success and power, was now synonymous with greed and deceit. The documents that Jonathan, Claire, and Sam had released were everywhere. No amount of money or influence could stop it now. But with every headline, every article that went live, Jonathan felt the noose tighten. He knew it was only a matter of time before those behind the Blackwell legacy struck back. That morning, Claire arrived at Jonathan's house, her face pale but determined. "It's all over the news," she said, her voice trembling. "People are already calling for investigations. There's going to be a full-blown inquiry." Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of what they had done settle heavily on his shoulders. "We knew this was coming," he said quietly. "The truth needed to come out." "But we're not safe," Claire whispered, glancing around as if expecting someone to break down the door at any moment. "They'll come for us, Jonathan. They'll come for Daniel." "I know," Jonathan replied, his voice grim, "but we have to stay ahead of them. Sam's setting up protections. He's got contacts who can help us disappear if it comes to that." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Disappear? You think it's going to get that bad?" Jonathan didn't want to admit it, but he knew it was a possibility. The people they had exposed weren't just going to roll over. They would fight back, ruthlessly. "We'll keep Daniel safe," he said. "That's all that matters right now." Later that afternoon, Jonathan and Claire drove to the hospital to check on Daniel. The doctors had informed them earlier that morning that Daniel had woken up and Jonathan needed to see him. But as they neared the hospital, a knot of dread tightened in Jonathan's gut. The truth was out, and they had exposed some of the most powerful people in the world. What if they retaliated? When they arrived, Jonathan rushed to Daniel's room, bracing himself for what he might find. Daniel was sitting up in bed, his face still bruised from the accident, but his eyes were alert, and there was a quiet strength in him that hadn't been there before. Jonathan exhaled in relief as he stepped into the room. "Daniel," he said softly. Daniel looked up, his expression unreadable. "I saw the news," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's all over the place. You exposed everything?" Jonathan nodded, moving closer to the bed. "We had to," he said quietly. "It was the only way to stop them." Daniel was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the window. "And now what?" he asked. "What happens next?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't have a clear answer. "We keep moving," he finally said. "We protect ourselves. We protect each other." Daniel turned to look at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "You think they'll come after me again?" Jonathan's heart clenched. "Not if I can help it. Sam's setting things in motion to keep us safe." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just want it to be over." Jonathan wished he could promise that, but he knew the battle wasn't finished yet. The forces they had exposed weren't going to disappear overnight. But he also knew they had made a choice, one that would shape the rest of their lives. That evening, Jonathan met with Sam in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe. The investigator looked worn, as though the weight of the expose had taken a toll on him too. But there was a spark of satisfaction in his eyes, one that told Jonathan they had done the right thing, even if the road ahead was dangerous. "It's spreading faster than we thought," Sam said, sliding a folder across the table. "The media's running with it. Politicians are distancing themselves from the Blackwell name. Investigators are going to start digging deeper, and some of the people tied to your father are going to panic." Jonathan flipped through the folder, seeing familiar names tied to his father's offshore dealings. People with power, influence, and more than a little to lose. "And the threats?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady but cautious. "They're going to escalate," Sam admitted. "I've already got word that some of the people involved are pulling favors to silence the story. But the good news is, it's too late. The media's got their hands on it, and the public's hungry for blood." Jonathan leaned back, exhaustion hitting him all at once. "And what about us?" Sam's face darkened. "You and your family are targets now. That's the reality. You've exposed people who don't play by the rules. But I've got plans in place to keep you off their radar for a while. You'll need to keep your heads low, stay out of sight until things cool down." Jonathan nodded, his resolve firming. "We're not running," he said. "Not yet." Sam's brow furrowed. "Jonathan, you need to understand. These people won't hesitate. They already went after Daniel once. If they feel cornered, they'll come for you next." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm not backing down." Sam studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Just be smart about it. I'll keep an eye on things from my end." That night, Jonathan returned to the family mansion. the one that now felt more like a monument to lies than the home he had grown up in. His mother, Margaret, was waiting for him in the sitting room, her face lined with grief and exhaustion. "They're calling for investigations into your father's business," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything is crumbling." Jonathan sat down across from her, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "It had to happen, Mom. We couldn't keep living under his shadow." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered, "but I never thought it would end like this." Jonathan's throat tightened. "What did you expect?" Margaret looked away, her voice breaking. "I expected him to protect us, to keep us safe, but instead, he built his empire on secrets that are tearing us apart." For the first time, Jonathan saw his mother not as the cold, distant woman who had held their family together, but as someone who had been trapped, just like him, just like Claire. She had spent her life trying to preserve the Blackwell name, only to watch it crumble at her feet. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said softly. Margaret blinked, surprised by his words. "Sorry? For what?" "For not seeing it sooner. For letting it go on for so long." Margaret shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "You did what you had to do. Your father, he was always going to fall. It was just a matter of time." Jonathan sat in silence, the enormity of what they had done settling over him. The Blackwell Empire, once untouchable, was now in ruins. The truth was out, but the cost had been higher than he ever could have imagined. The next morning, Jonathan received a call from Sam. His voice was urgent, tense. "They made their move," Sam said. "The people you exposed, they've been rounded up. There are arrests happening across the board." "You did it, Jonathan." Jonathan's breath caught. It was over. The powerful people behind his father's empire were being brought down, one by one. The truth had finally prevailed. But as Jonathan stood there, the phone still in his hand, he realized that this wasn't just the end. It was a new beginning. For him, for Claire, for Daniel. The legacy of lies had been destroyed, and now they had a chance to build something new, something honest. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The weight of the Blackwell name had been lifted, and while the road ahead was uncertain, it was theirs to walk, free from the shadows of the past.